Okay, I'm going to attempt to show how these gears work, particularly the synchros. I call this the slider. The brass thing is your synchro ring. And then these teeth, I call them synchro mesh teeth. They're actually attached to the gear. So here's a synchro. Brand new one. You see the notches in it? Those notches line up with these notches. And in those notches are what's called detents. And they're spring loaded. That's a detent. And it kind of rides in that notch. Now when you overshift, that allows the slider to go too far in that direction, and then this end can pop up like that, and then this will turn, and then you can't get out of that gear and go back because it has to line up. And plus, once those pop up, even if you do happen to get this lined up, trying to pull it and force it back down, it's pretty much impossible. You have to take the tranny apart. Now this is what you call a brand new synchro, and if you look at the teeth, when you examine them, they have nice sharp crisp points on them. And it's kind of hard to tell by this because it doesn't zoom in very well, but this is a bad synchro. I don't know if you can see very well, but the teeth are all rounded off. They're not sharp and crisp. They're blunt right in the front of the things. So this is a first gear set. This is out of the early transmissions. The later transmissions have grooves, 2 grooves cut all the way around the center of the teeth. That's how you know they're for the later models. They have a different amount of teeth on them. And here you can see the synchro mesh teeth, the dark ones, and then they line up with the synchro itself. And you can see the detents in place with the C spring in there that keeps them pushed out. And then the slider slides this direction and over the top of the synchro and onto these synchro mesh teeth, and that's what locks it into gear. So the gear shift transfers to the forks, which are right in this slot. And then when it shifts, it pushes the forks push the slider back this direction over the top of them. And then when it shifts into second gear is over here, it would slide over onto second gear. And then third and fourth gear operate the same way. This is a shift fork for third and fourth gear. And the shift fork for first and second looks like this. And when I examine them, I look to see how deep the groove is. Take a dial caliper or a micrometer and check, and then if the groove is too deep, that's probably what causes overshifting. And I braze them up with brass and then file them down to the original thickness. It's a little harder to do this one, but you can see how that's worn down quite a bit, but you can fill that with brass, and I use a Dremel tool to clean it up, get it flat again. Now here I'm going to pull the slider off of this thing, and those detents will probably pop out. I'll try to slide it. Well, see, they stayed in there real nice. And this is called the hub. That's what the slider slides over. And you got your synchro. You check synchros by checking the gap. It's between them. When there's no gap, they're totally worn out. When they're new, they have a gap of not quite a 32nd of an inch. In there, but they can be pretty thin gap. Like this one's only, it's not even half worn out. When they get down there where it's a paper thin gap, then they're getting down there a ways. They're probably still good for a long time. I know I've taken transmissions apart where people said they had no trouble shifting in the first gear, but yet the synchro had no gap at all. Now, a common cause of popping out a gear is these synchro mesh teeth are supposed to be crisp and sharp points, and the points get banged up and they get rounded off, and then it doesn't shift right. And the same thing can happen to the slider. These should be crisp and sharp points too, and if a bunch of them are banged up and rounded over, then it'll have problems staying in gear too. Incidentally, the first and second gear detents have the number 51. Now if you look, you probably won't be able to see them, but if you look at the ends of these, they're like notched on the left and right side. If this is a dual unit where if it goes one way it shifts in the second gear, if it goes this way it shifts in the first. So those little notches that are on each side of these are on both sides. If this was designed only to go one direction for one gear, like say the granny gear, then it only has those little notches on each side. It's only about, it goes in about that direction in about 1/8 of an inch. It's kind of hard to see them. It only have those notches on one side, so when you install these, you got to make sure that those little notches are going towards the synchro mesh and the synchro teeth. If you happen to put it on backwards and it doesn't have those, like on the back side, might not have those because it's a one-way slider. You just have to be careful. I found that the bevel is how you kind of tell which way the slider goes. On almost all the sliders, the bevel is always forward, except for first and second gear. For some reason, it's reversed and it's on the aft side of it. But I don't think it makes any difference. If you happen to flip it the wrong way, on first and second only, it wouldn't make a difference. But all the rest of them, make sure your bevel's pointed forward. And I think that's about it for how the synchros and detents. There will be 2 springs for the detents. I didn't have the other spring in. There's one goes on each side of the hub, so 2 of them. On the 3rd, 4th gear, they don't use this type of a spring. They use actual real coil springs, and there's 3 of them, and it has holes that the springs drop into. Anyway, that's pretty much all I know about synchros and maybe how to tell if they're going to be working or not. Now these sliders you can't buy. You might be able to find a synchro or 2 to buy somewhere. These you can't buy, so you have to if you have to replace it, you need to get it from a donor transmission. That's why it's nice to keep a transmission around for parts. Now this is for the steel fork. This is a narrow slot. For the aluminum forked ones, the slot is quite a bit wider, so they're not interchangeable between the years. So you got to keep an eye out for that too. Alright, that's about it. If I had an aluminum fork sitting here, I would show you what an aluminum fork looks like. Okay, here's what the aluminum forks look like. So this is wider than the steel one. It's a little bit thicker, so you can't use the sliders aren't interchangeable. Anyway, and then you got the slot in there. The slot is narrower on the aluminum ones than it is on the steel ones. See the difference. And this isn't interchangeable anyway for the steel ones, because this part right here is narrower. You can't put an aluminum one on here. It won't go. It's too wide. Plus, there's a different amount of teeth on this too versus the early and late. Well, while we're here looking at this is fifth gear. They're identical through all years and interchangeable. This is fourth gear, same thing, identical through all the years, interchangeable. Third gear, identical. Second gear, identical. They're all interchangeable. First gear is not interchangeable. It has a different amount of teeth on them. And like I said before, the difference is there's a groove cut all the way around. 2 grooves on the later models for the aluminum forks. Alright, that's like 11 minutes. I think I'll quit.